Hello, and thank you so much for coming to the CPI. Oh, good evening, and thank you so much for being a part of North Dakota Post Adopt and our monthly webinar. So this month, what we will be talking about in this webinar is something called CPI, which I will discuss more in the future. We'll just start with a quick introduction about who I am. So my name is Brittany Engelhard. I am a licensed social worker. I am the post-adopt coordinator for the southwestern part of the state. I have been with North Dakota Post Adopt since March of 2019, so almost 2 years. And prior to that, I do have experience working with at-risk, homeless, traffic, and struggling youth and families in the Bismarck community. I have been working for a total almost 6 years now at the child welfare system, and I was born and raised in Mandan, North Dakota, and I am the mother of 2 beautiful children. I have a daughter whose name's Harper and a son whose name is Will. So CPI is the acronym for Crisis Prevention Institute. So really what this training is it's a lot of people think of what CPI is, a lot of people think of like the holds as being the primary training that is involved in CPI, when in fact it's actually the opposite. What this is meant to do is it's nonviolent crisis intervention, and really what that means is teaching parents or service providers the skills to intervene with behaviors so it does not escalate for the need of physical holds. So just so you know too, this is really just this is an introduction to CPI. It doesn't go towards the certification of being CPI certified, unfortunately, just because of the time frame. If you wanted to look into a full CPI training, it's about 8 hours, so it's quite a commitment as far as time. And because this is virtual, I will not be going over the physical holds in detail. That would be pretty difficult for me to show you that aspect of it. So we will just go to the introduction aspect of it, and then also the de-escalation tools that we can teach parents to. So CPI's philosophy ultimately is considering the care, welfare, safety, and security, not only of those youth or those individuals who may be struggling and at risk of putting others in harm or themselves in harm, but it's also considering all parties that are involved prior and after the escalation or the incident, so to speak, as far as like the behaviors or the concerns about safety. So it's really just considering all aspects of well-being for everybody who is involved, regardless of if they were physically there in the moment or after. Okay. So I'll go through this quickly. It's quite extensive, and again, we only have an hour, so I will go over some of this pretty quickly. So the development model, what I appreciate about this is it really kind of breaks down what parents or service providers can look for in regards to whether a youth is struggling, just to kind of see what they are portraying, right? Like, what are they doing that makes you wonder if they're potentially going to escalate, or if there's safety concerns that might come about. This is really a tool to help you identify those things early, and it puts them in a little bit of categories here. And what I also like on the other side is it helps you, gives you tips and tactics on how to intervene when they're at each level. I'll quickly go over each level and then each supportive approach that you would like to apply to each of those levels quickly. So that first one is anxiety, which is essentially what it means by definition is if any change in behavior. So if you have a kid who is generally pretty outgoing, energetic, pretty full of life, and all of a sudden you're kind of noticing that child's withdrawing, or just any changes that in behavior, I think it's people's natural response to kind of disregard those really small changes, right? But as we know, like those kids who have significant trauma backgrounds, or significant abuse histories. We want to always keep those, even if they seem like really small changes, we want to keep those in mind and identify those and be aware of those, right? So if we are noticing those changes in behavior, whatever they may be, what we as parents, adults, and professionals can do to help that person is really be supportive. And by supportive, I mean empathetic and non-judgmental approach, right? So it could be something as simply as pointing out that change in behavior, right? So Jen, I'm noticing that you are a little withdrawn. You've been going to your room, or maybe you're not eating as much as you have been lately. So acknowledging, right, that change in behavior, that anxiety level, and really just giving them the floor, right? So what's going on with that? Like, I noticed this, so what's going on? And hopefully what that does is really, I mean, it depends on the kiddo. Obviously, everybody's different, but I think doing it in that mutual level and not in it like accusing way, and just kind of a very matter of fact, this is kind of what you're observing, and approaching it with like a genuine curiosity. So what's going on with that? Help me understand that. And really what is I do encourage parents to do in these moments where I can tell you that I've been guilty of this numerous times, but I think parents oftentimes want to help, right? Like, so try to fill them with like, is it this? Is this going on? Is this happening? And really kind of trying to I don't want to say manipulate, but really encouraging them to kind of maybe go pick those answers, because those might be easiest and those might be easier to talk about by just saying, yes, that's it. But really what parents can do to best serve kids when they're in this anxiety level is just acknowledging that behavior and really leaving it as an open forum for that kid. And you may get awkward silence. You may not get a response, or maybe you might have to be a little bit more guided with your questions. But I definitely encourage parents as an initial to leave it open for kiddos, right? And give them that opportunity to really check in with themselves. Maybe they don't even notice that they're observed. So just giving them that time and really being open to listening to what they have to say is very important, okay? So that next crisis development level is the defensive level. During this defensive stage, it's really where kids or anybody, I suppose, in general, it's where they're beginning to lose rationality. So at this stage, they might start to verbally escalate, right? They might start calling names. They might be a little belligerent. They might just refuse to do anything. And in this, like one way that you can kind of test, if they, like when I say begin to lose rationality in this defensive stage, they still have some level of rational thinking, right? They haven't gone to that amygdala, right? Meaning that trauma response, or the response that's really where they're not they're not responding to it intentionally, right? That's just like the response that they have dealt with in the past. And that's something that just comes as a response to a stressful situation. So if they're in this defensive mode, one simple thing that parents can do or adults can do to help these kiddos, or even just to kind of gauge where they're at, are they still semi-rational, or are they completely not there anymore, and saying anything will not help this kiddo, right? So one of the tactics you could do is, if like asking the kiddo to perform some really, really, really simplistic request by the parent, right? Whether it be, can you please sit down, right? Or can you put your hands at your sides? Asking them to do some real simple request is a good way to test whether they're in that defensive mode or if they're going to that amygdala trauma response. So if they're able to follow through with those simple directives, then we know that there is still some level of rationality. And so if we've tested that, so our directives are really to be, directive means de-escalating and escalating behavior, right? So what parents can do is giving simple, like I said, giving very simple requests, giving if then situations. There's another slide actually down here that goes a little bit more into those defensive behaviors and appropriate responses. So I won't go any further into that until we get to that slide. Again, that next level is risk behavior. And what risk behavior is really is, it's when the behavior is present that puts a kiddo at risk or somebody else in the presence at risk. So this one, I know parents can oftentimes confuse, rightfully so, right? So if a kid is in your face and they might be swearing at you or threatening to harm you in some way, unless they have done some physical act to put you in direct harm or themselves in direct harm, they would still be considered part of that defensive stage, right? So that risk behavior is ultimately doing an active gesture to show that they are intending to harm themselves or others. And according to CPI, those interventions would be a physical intervention. Again, we aren't going to go over those details, but the tension reduction is the next one. And like the tension reduction is also, it's not, a disclaimer, like when you are working with your kiddo or you're noticing possibly some escalating behaviors, it's not going to, in your brain, I don't expect you to go, okay, they're at the anxiety level or they're at the defensive level. Like I don't expect you guys to go level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, right? Like they can maybe start at anxiety, go to defensive, go back to anxiety, maybe jump to risk behavior. This isn't a black and white process on how behaviors work because we're all individuals. We all handle it differently. This is just a guide to help you really kind of get it more of in a formal format so it makes more sense, right? So this tension reduction stage, that final 4 stage, this can be applied to any other level. Like this is really just our final step in that crisis development model. And again, so if a kiddo is in anxiety and you feel like you were supportive and you feel like it went good, it's okay to jump to this tension reduction stage, meaning, or you might see a responsive tension reduction. And really what that means is it's exhaustion, right? So a kiddo they might be in the defensive stage. They might be saying hurtful things. They might have gone to a risk behavior. They might have done things. Ultimately, what this tension reduction is, it's that when they come back out of that amygdala brain and they're really starting to realize what's going on, they're getting more logical. They're starting to come back to it, and what they might realize is what you're going to see is maybe some remorse or some crying or some physical exhaustion, depending on how worked up they got, if they got up to that risk behavior or not. So what we can do as parents and professionals is really provide that therapeutic rapport. And ultimately what that means is making sure that they have a safe place where you come back to that, right? So sometimes it's really easy to kind of breeze over these things where, yep, they might have gotten anxious and defensive, might have had a behavior, might not have. And it's easy to just say that happened, we're moving on. But one thing that CPI really encourages parents to do is always come back to it. It might not be right after the behavior that happens, but it's always important to kind of process with that youth after whatever level happens, because that's really opening up, like helping understand what's going on through their head and see if they have any understanding of where that came from, really trying to figure out and talk through that. And also it's a really good opportunity to plan for in the future. So hoping that doesn't happen in the future, but if it does, like you ask the youth, how can I be helpful to you? And also you give feedback and kind of come up with a game plan mutually, which feels really good and gives that youth some power too for future interventions if we need to do that. Okay, so with that, so a lot of what de-escalation is really talking about being aware of our nonverbal communication, because I believe, don't quote me on it, but I want to say that 80% of the messages that we send out into the world and people perceive are ultimately nonverbal communication. So this is really encouraging people to be more self-aware and it's okay to have, like, that's wonderful if you have the words to say. But if your nonverbals are completely conflicting what you're saying, it's not going to be helpful, right? So this is just encouraging people to be more aware of those nonverbals that we send out into the world. So what the first part of the nonverbal aspect of it is proxemics, and what that means is personal space. So this is kind of a general guideline of what personal space looks like. If you look in the middle, that's obviously the individual. There's that intimate space, which is in pretty close proxemics to that person. Then you have that personal space, which might be close friends, family might be in there. Then you have social space, which is if they're out in the community, this is kind of how close. Social is maybe like classrooms or schools or stuff like that. And then out in the public, if there's somewhere public, that's going to be most people's comfort level. Again, this is just a general idea of people's feelings and preferences on their proxemics to other individuals. However, if we have, for example, a kiddo who's experienced very significant sexual trauma, like some of the behaviors that we see that might be confusing to us are that child may not have an appropriate personal boundaries in space, right? So they may meet somebody and within a minute, they're wanting a hug, they're wanting to be carried, they're wanting to sit on laps. And so these are things like everybody's proxemics are different. However, these are safe. This is a safe guideline tool to use, right? So if we notice that our young, lovely kiddo maybe has some sexual trauma, we're noticing that they're entering a lot of people's personal space. It's not only important to help show them what personal space, like how that's important and how we don't know these people and having all of those appropriate talks, but we also want to consider the other person that's involved in that too, right? So they may have this stereotypical idea of what personal space looks like, right? So if even a young child enters that space, that might feel really invasive to them. So it's really considering the proxemics of all parties involved. The next nonverbal communication is kinesics, and what this is our body language. Obviously, it's really easy to say what you need to say and know the right words, but we want to make sure that our body language is oftentimes matching what we're saying. Guilty parent, I have been frustrated with my kids, and I think like it's a natural parent response. Like I will notice that I'm putting my hands on my hips, right? Or I'm crossing my arms when I'm dealing with them when I'm frustrated, or I'm looking at them like kind of narrow eyes, try to be stern with my gestures. And in the past, really, I felt like that was how they know I'm in control, and I want them to know that this is something serious. But really, what these messages send ultimately might be really scary, right? Especially for a kid who is not a biological kid. If they're a foster kid, you know them, but you might not know all of their past history. There's trauma there. All of these factors can influence how somebody responds to these nonverbals, regardless of how significant they may seem in those moments. Some of the suggestions by Dr. Karen Purvis are to never, like when you, like a lot of times when kiddos are in trouble, like what parents' response is like, you need to look me in the eyes, right? And it's more of a stern request that they look you in your eyes, right? And what we're sending as a message is really that negative message, right? So what we always want to be conscious of is if we are requesting that a kiddo look us in the eye, we make sure that it's a very kind eye, right? And it's a supportive and it's not stern, right? And we want to be aware of where our arms are when we're talking to them. Are we making eye contact with them? Are we being attentive to what they have to say, right? So all of these things send messages, and ultimately it's respect, because I think a lot of kids that maybe have not grown up in the homes that they're currently at might feel like they don't have a lot of control, or they might not feel heard or valued. And by simply showing, like getting on their level, maybe if they're sitting on the couch, sitting down beside them, making sure that they know that they are being heard and you are listening, and they have that forum and that safe place to talk, and you're communicating like you're saying, I understand, I want to listen, I want to support you, and your body language is doing the same message. You're going to get a lot better response than handling it like a stern parent to a kid who has behaved inappropriately or wrong, right? Okay. And the last one is haptics, and this is language through touch. So really, I mean, this again is every person is different, right? There might be kids who love to feel physical touch, right? Their love language is physical touch. And so giving them a hug if they seem to be getting worked up, or putting your hand on their back, or rubbing their back, even if it's as simple as a high five, like really gauging where kids are at or people are at, and if they need that haptics. Again, you want to know your demographic before you intervene, because I think, if your love language is physical touch, or you see somebody upset or struggling, I think it's people's natural reaction to want to give them hugs, or give, like, put your hand on their back, or really comfort them. But knowing if there is some type of trauma background, that could be really, really triggering for kids. And so just being aware, and even if they're old enough to identify, like, it's okay to ask them, like, when you're worked up, do you like this? Do you need this? Is this helpful? So clarifying that on the front end, because what you think they need or what you want to do to support them might not always be the most helpful thing for them. So just being aware of that. So this kind of goes back to that proxemics and kinetics, but it's really this is really a safe way to interact with people who are getting escalated, getting worked up, right? And what this is called is, it's the supportive stance, and this is being aware of your position, posture, and proximity. So proximity is making sure that you are, like, if you're working with a kiddo, we're going to pretend that the gentleman on the right in the blue shirt is the one being agitated, getting worked up, right? So what we want to observe is that she is longer than one arm length away, okay? So that's a safe place for you to be, right? So it's not in their intimate space. It's not quite in their personal space. It's really in that neutral space that's not going to feel intimidating or scary for that person. The position that you want to do is really a bit of a side stance when you're talking with them, not going straight on, because, right, that might be considered intimidating. Obviously, we don't want to face away from them, because that could be perceived as disregarding what they're having to say, or just be perceived as rude, right? Or also put your safety at risk, where you want to be aware of your environment if there's risk potentially involved, right? So standing sideways when you're facing that person, ultimately, and additionally, what that does too is it's a safety measure too. So if that gentleman does get violent, or you need to get out of that situation, standing in that supportive stance gives you a better opportunity to get away quicker and safely. Okay, so the paraverbal communication, what this is, sorry, give me just one second here. Okay, so paraverbal is the local part of speech, excluding actual words used. So tone is the quality and pitch, right? So quality and pitch meaning, are you talking to that person? Is it coming off as possibly sarcastic? Is it coming off as impatient? Is it coming off as kind? It's how you say something using your quality and pitch, okay? So volume is loudness and intensity, right? Are you raising your voice when you're talking to the kiddo, or do you find yourself when the kiddo's raising their voice, are you responding to kind of match that, or get louder than that, or are you speaking so quietly that they aren't able to hear you, right? You want to be able to find a very neutral, safe tone, and being aware of that, because going higher could potentially continue to escalate that situation. And the cadence is, are you speaking really fast or are you speaking really slow? Like maybe if you get uncomfortable in confrontation, like you might want to talk really fast, like it might be really weird or uncomfortable. Just being cognizant of those things and self-aware of those things can be really helpful when you're intervening with those kiddos in those moments. Okay, so like I did say when we were talking about the defensive stage and then the development model, and how we appropriately intervene in that. So this is like the verbal escalation continuum, and you'll see in the middle that it is part of that defensive response, right? So if we notice that that kid is getting defensive, and again, what that is usually it's verbal, it's losing rational, it's yelling, it's swearing, it's all of these kinds of things, but it's mostly verbal. And again, it doesn't cross the line of putting people with physical harm, right? So what these different levels are is kind of, I'll go over each of these parts of the kite here, and then we'll give tips on how you can helpfully intervene with kiddos depending on the stage that they're on, right? So that first one down at the bottom right is questioning. There are two types of questioning that can happen in this. So if a kiddo is frustrated, and I'm a mother, and I can tell you that when I get the whys, it drives me absolutely bonkers, right? So when I say whys, meaning like I will say, go brush your teeth. Why? Because you need to have clean breath. Why? Because it's almost time for bed. Why? If you get those continued, like if you think about it, the reason why they're doing that is most likely not because they want to genuinely understand that, right? So that means that it's going to be usually just a challenging thing, or something that's really meant to grind your gears potentially. So because it's not like it's a challenging way of questioning, what is an appropriate response for us as caregivers or professionals is really downplaying the challenging behavior, right? So kind of brushing it off, like maybe just acting like, oh, it's no big deal, trying to maybe distract and switch the subject. Or like another simplistic thing is that you could offer like two options, right? You can either go brush your teeth and then get into your pajamas and before you go to bed, or you can either get in your pajamas and then brush your teeth. So giving really simple limit setting, but also giving them some opportunity to have some insight can be helpful for that kiddo. And then the other style of questioning is if they're actually asking a legit question, like that they seem to genuinely want to know or understand, right? So the easy response to that is if they want to know something and then seem like it's genuine, you can absolutely answer that question in confidence, right? So that's the easy questioning aspect. So if they're in the questioning, they might move up to refusal if they're not satisfied with what they got or they didn't like the limits, right? They could move up to that refusal, which means non-compliance. So really you're saying, can you please brush your teeth? Can you please put your pajamas on? And it's no, consistent, right? And what you want to do in this stage, again, is you just want to go back to that limit setting. And we'll talk more about there's a couple different examples of limit setting in the future, but just making them really simple, clear, concise, ideas of what your expectations are without just overloading them with information, right? Or being or calling them out or approaching it in a way where you're getting frustrated, because I can imagine like that refusal stage is not a fun thing for parents to deal with. It can be really frustrating, and that's again why I want to refer you back to those nonverbal communication styles, right? Like your tone and your cadence and proxemics and all of that stuff. So being aware of all of that is really important when you're dealing with kiddos. So again, setting limits would be a good aspect. I'll go over those in detail a little bit later. The next part is on the top there. There's that release. So if they get to this stage, it's a verbal and emotional outburst, right? They're losing rationality. They're letting off steam. They're screaming, swearing, highly irritated, agitated, saying all sorts of cuss words that you've never heard come out of their mouth before or knew that they knew, right? So if they're in this part, they're not going to be able to listen to you talk rationally, right? So if you are going to try to intervene and try to talk with them, they're not in this place where they're going to listen to when they're at this stage. So what us as parents can do is if there's other people around, make sure that we are removing the crowd, right? So a lot of times people kind of feed off the audience and might respond to that, or maybe the audience might encourage or giggle or intervene. That's not in a helpful way. So getting rid of anybody else, because ultimately we want to consider safety. So removing that audience and removing yourself, as long as you're making sure that they're not moving up to that risk behavior stage where they're going to cause direct harm to themselves or others, but allowing them to vent. So if they're screaming and yelling, saying all the cuss words in the book, just allow them to do that and get it out, right? So just give them that time, because they're not going to listen to anything that you're saying, right? So if they do move to the intimidation stage, this could be, again, this is something that I think parents kind of teeter on whether to take it as a risk behavior or if they're still in the defensive stage, because it can be really scary, right? If they're getting in your face, if it's really a scary thing, right? One thing that you do need to do is take all threats seriously, right? So if they are threatening you or another family member, you need to make sure to remove yourself from that. If they're telling you that they're going to harm themselves, so the response really would be you need to call law enforcement or potentially take that child to the hospital to get assessed for mental health services, because you want to make sure that you're taking everything seriously, because the risk is that if you don't, we don't want to have anybody come into harm's way, right? So if we can prevent that, yes, it might be messy. Yes, it might, bringing law enforcement into it for assistance might get messy, but ultimately what our purpose is we want to make sure that that youth and everybody else in that home is safe, right? So it might not feel great, but just make sure that you are taking all threats seriously and seeking assistance if available. And assistance isn't another child that's in the home, making sure that it is a spouse or significant other or somebody that is in the home that is an adult that is also aware of CPI and understanding of this level of trauma and responses and all of that can help you through this, to make sure that you're reaching out to those people. Okay, and the last one is, again, it's the same one as the crisis model. It's that tension reduction, right? That's where there's that physical release, right? They might just like collapse in exhaustion. They might start crying. This is when they're starting to gain their rationality back, realizing what happened. So that's that tension reduction stage. And our response to that is really, again, that therapeutic rapport. We want to be supportive. We want to meet that kid's needs. We want to let them know, like, despite what's happened, because it might be really embarrassing for them, or they might be really scared that you're going to push them away, just for them to know that you're safe, like you understand, and you're okay. Just making sure that they know that you are still there for them, right? That's very important for you to hear and to see. Okay, so like I said, we would talk a little bit about the limit setting aspect. So a couple of just keys to limit setting is making sure things are really, really simple and really, really clear, right? So making sure if we expect a kiddo to have something cleaned on a certain day at a certain time, we want to make sure that that's very well known, and we want to make sure that it's one task at a time. We don't want to say when you want to make sure that limits are very simple and clear, because if we say you need to, for example, clean your room, right? In our minds, it makes sense, like that they clean everything, and that might make sense for us as adults, right? But a kid might not interpret that. They might think they might be overloaded, right? They might be like, I don't know if that means like vacuuming, is that making my bed, just picking up my floor. So really being simple and clear about what your expectations are and those limits that you have are going to be much more helpful and leave a lot less room for miscommunication, right? Making sure that they're reasonable too. Are they something that, knowing this child, maybe their developmental level, are they able to easily and successfully complete these limits that we're giving them and fall within that? And if they are unable, then you might need to reassess your expectations, right? Or you might need to be helpful when you're setting those limits. It might be you guys team up and do it, and it might be some modeling stuff to make sure that they get a good idea of what they're expected to do before we kind of just leave it out to them, right? Also, make sure it's enforceable too. I can tell you that personally, for a while, I had a habit of, I don't know if any of you can relate to this, but so it's like my kids are dawdlers naturally when we're leaving the house, right? So it's like I'm constantly like, get your shoes on, get your coat on, and sure, 10 minutes later when I'm coming back out and ready to go, there's no shoes, there's nothing, they're not ready to go, right? So usually it's like we're going to grandma's house for something that I already had planned out, right? They love going to grandma's, but my response to them not getting their shoes on is, you need to get your shoes on or we're not going to grandma's. So I would say this thinking that it would motivate them. However, thinking back on it, there was no way we were not going to grandma's anyways, right? So if we say these things as an intent to be a scare tactic and are unable to make sure that we follow through with these, like it's not going to be a good training tool for this kid. They're going to learn that, oh, they don't follow through or they're not consistent with it, right? So making sure that when you are setting these limits, you can actually enforce them, okay? Just some examples of limit setting really quick are interrupt and redirect pattern, which this is more so if they're in like the questioning or refusal stage, if they're just being little stinkers and not like screaming and yelling at you, it's okay to just interrupt and be like, okay, stop. And what I asked you to do, can you please do this, right? Or can we do this together to get this done? It's okay to just stop and interrupt. And again, I don't say like, shut the heck up. That's not what interrupt means. It's really like a stern, like you need to stop, or I need you to stop so that you can hear me, and then go ahead and continue with that redirection pattern. A when and then and an if and then are fairly similar, right? So an if then, it's really helpful, like if you include like the motivator on the front end, right? Or change it into something positive rather than something negative, right? So instead of saying like, if you don't get your homework done, you won't be able to go out with your friends on Friday, right? So instead of using a negative if then pattern, which can be like children don't, and kids and youth and adolescents don't typically love hearing those things, try thinking about like if your gut is going to that, try to really challenge your brain and thinking about how can I spin this into something positive, right? So instead of focusing on a punishment, maybe trying to focus on a reward, right? So it could be as simple as, if you get this done, then you can definitely go out with your friends. Like, so even just changing that and reinforcing that they will be able to see their friends if they do complete this can kind of change the response that you get rather than being more negative focused. So just keep that in mind if you're doing the if then or when then pattern, okay? Okay, so empathetic listening. I think that most of you are adoptive parents, are foster parents in the past, so I am completely confident that you are incredibly empathetic and very wonderful listeners. So really what this means is providing non-judgmental forum, giving kids your undivided attention, again, making sure you're not being aware of your proxemics and kind of where you're standing when interacting with the kiddo. So if they're sitting down, feel free to sit down with them. If they're sitting on the floor, feel free to sit down on the floor, and try not to power over them or stand over them, because that might feel intimidating. But just making sure that we're getting down on their level to listen to them. Listen carefully, allow for silence and reflection. I know that's kind of a bad habit of mine, is when there's silence, I think I naturally want to fill that silence, right? Because it feels weird and uncomfortable to me, but just making sure that you're comfortable in that moment, because a lot of times talking about things really encourages kids to kind of process and think back through that. And so they might need some more time to process that if they might be a little slow at processing. So just allowing silence and feeling comfortable with that. And this one, the last one's kind of like a social work 101 kind of way to interact with people. It's restate and paraphrase. A lot of times what I've noticed is people can say something and I will be like, whoa, that was an interesting way to place this, or I'm not sure if they meant to come off like this, but that's kind of how I interpret it. So it's helpful, like if you get those whoa moments where you're hearing something and you're like, I don't know if I agree with that, or if they know that they're meaning it to come out like that. It's completely okay to restate what they said, because oftentimes they might not even be aware of how it comes off, right? So rephrasing, so saying, let me get this straight. This, right? And what that oftentimes does is they'll probably be like, oh, no, yeah, I didn't mean for it to come off like that. My bad. And it'll just really encourage them a little bit more self-reflection and kind of how they come off, and be more aware of themselves and what they say. So it really helps encourage them to think a little bit deeper about how they say things and interact with people. Just some things to consider when we're looking at dealing with at-risk youth and trauma histories and all of that jazz, is really considering some precipitating factors. And what this means is that they're things that influence kids or people's behaviors in general, right? So there's internal factors and there's external factors. Some of those internal ones can be, there might be some impaired communication. They might not be able to appropriately verbalize their needs, their wants. Or they might feel like they don't have control. There might be that trauma brain response, that amygdala response, where they might not be fully aware and in tune of how they're responding or what they're doing, right? There might be expectations or unmet needs that parents or foster parents aren't aware of, right? So they might be hungry, and what we're seeing is a lot different than, we might not connect those, right? If they're hungry or tired or not feeling safe, or like they may respond in a way that is completely like does not connect the idea that they're hungry, right? But just being aware that we do respond in, maybe because in the past they haven't had their needs met, they were oftentimes hungry, their brain response might go to that, again, amygdala trauma brain response, and their response might be like destroying furniture or breaking glasses. And most times I don't think people would logically be like, oh yeah, they must be hungry, that's why they're destroying my kitchen. So just being aware of those unmet needs and how in the past that might have impacted them internally is really important. Some of those external ones is attitudes and behaviors of others. We can't control how other people interact with our kids, and it might conflict them, it might encourage or help influence the way, like, let's say the kids socially are having trouble at school. They might not verbally tell you this when they're going home, but you're noticing oftentimes they're withdrawn when they get home, or they're agitated when they get home. And there could be oftentimes peer conflict. It's just being aware of those changes in behavior and making sure that we're actively aware of what's going on, and the kiddo feels like they have a safe place to talk about those things with you, right? Back to that empathetic listening. But we as parents need, or as safe adults, need to point those areas where it's not quite making sense. Their behavior is changing, right? We need to point those out to help them be more self-aware of that. It might be their physical environment. Like, do they not like the bright lights, or is the area too familiar or triggering for them? So just being aware of their environment and how that can influence it too. Their stimulus response, again, that's the sensory response. Are they sitting in the grass where maybe the grass the texture might remind them of something, and they might go back to that amygdala brain, being aware of stimulus. And I have for example, my son, he will only wear skinny jeans as pants because he likes the compression, and he won't wear any other kind. So he's kind of sensory in that aspect, where if I try to even sneak like boot cut jeans in, he's calling me out on it, right? So just honoring those kids and their stimulus and making sure that we're aware of those sensory issues or concerns that they may have, and the level of value, dignity, and respect afforded to people. Again, this is really just like our morals. We don't have control over people around us and all of that jazz. So really trying to give a kid a good foundation as far as values and dignity and respect and all of that is really a great thing, because honestly, they might not have been shown that in the past. So if we can give them that core values and morals and dignity, and it will help them interact positively with the world in the future. Okay, so rational detachment, it's big fancy words, right? So essentially what this means is it's really, really easy to personalize like behaviors that are happening, right? Like you might blame yourself, like this is my fault, did I trigger them? Like it's totally normal to feel these ways, but oftentimes with kids with trauma, what we need to understand is that it's not about you. So what we need to do is rationally detach from this, right? We need to get out of that emotional response in those moments, and we need to try to be calm. We need to try to maintain composure, don't take it personally, and find positive outlets for negative energy following a crisis, right? Or even if it's in those moments, if you have a partner or spouse, if you need to tap out, if it's too emotionally overcharging and exhausting for you, I hope that you have that outlet to be able to like tag him in, like your spouse in, and go remove yourself from that situation, because that is really important. An integrated experience, you might have noticed that was part of that development model, and I didn't go over it because we're going over it now. So integrated experience in a nutshell is essentially meaning that so kids' behavior, the anxiety defensive, right, that behavior affects how parents respond. So parents have the tools, right? They can be supportive, directive, and all of that jazz, or oftentimes in stressful things, like just being aware that your interactions and how you interact with kids, like again, nonverbals, all of that jazz directly can impact how well this is going to go. Is it going to go to anxiety and defensive and eventually to risk behavior because you're getting really frustrated, you might not be handling things, you might, like, your body language is probably saying something, that you might be a part of that escalation process, right? Or are we handling it, like, are we being very factual, very calm, very supportive, very empathetic? And hopefully if they're defensive, they can move down to the anxiety, and they can just, like, hopefully we know that, like, so we are adults, and we have the responsibility to help these youth through this, because they are obviously not always able to deal with these tough process and these feelings. And so we have that responsibility to be aware that we can be a part of the problem, or we can be a part of the solution. Okay, so decision making, I'll go over this really, really quickly because we're almost out of time. Okay, so the decision making matrix, what I really actually like about this is I am a pretty emotional thinker. I like to try to think really logically about things. I'm really good at thinking logically after the fact, but in those moments, I tend to be very emotionally charged in those stressful crisis moments. Okay, so what this really does is it kind of gives you a format that helps take you out of that emotional brain response in those tough situations. And what this essentially is, it's talking about, think of a behavior. It might be something your kid has done, or something that like a risk behavior, right? So something that physically is putting themselves or others in harm. Think of a risk behavior, and just like, for example, what I think about is I worked at a shelter with kiddos, and I got a call where a young lady was wrapping the cord for the blinds around her neck, right? So in my mind, I was obviously freaking out. I needed to get the heck there. I needed to help her. Clearly that was a sign, like a pretty pretty blatant sign that maybe she's struggling and she needs some mental health help, right? So I ended up getting there and all of this, and then after the fact, you think about it and you're like, that was really scary. But if we look at it from this perspective, okay, so we're looking at likelihood and severity of these risk behaviors that we see, right? So the likelihood, just looking at this young lady specifically, she was in there for a short time. She's only done that once, right? So her likelihood is going to be on that low. So it's going to be the left side there, right? And then we look at on the left side there, the severity level. So if we think about it, the fact that she was wrapping the blind cord around her neck, yes, that's concerning, right? But if we think about it logistically, how successful at taking her own life could she be with a cord that's blinds that would easily have ripped off the wall? And she had supervision 24/7, so that the likelihood of her following through with potentially ending her life was pretty minimal, right? It was more just the intent was scary, right? So we would actually put her at the lowest level there as severity too. So she would be low, right? So another example of this is really self-harming. If there's a kiddo who scratches or cuts their arms or other places on their body, what we need to consider is, let's say the kiddo does it often, right? So they'd be more on the right side of likelihood. But if we think about severity, depending on the level, right? So do they have to get stitches? Are they getting hospitalized when these are happening? But if they're oftentimes superficial, which usually self-harming is most of the time pretty superficial, we would put them on the low level of severity there. So she would still be in that low light green level, right? So again, there's tons of scenarios, but what I like about this is really it takes out that emotional response that we feel. And again, I don't want you to whip out your decision-making matrix when there's a risk behavior happening and try to make that assessment. This is really for afterwards and processing, right? Or what you can do if you identify risk behaviors that have happened in the past. Why don't you sit down with that youth and sit down with your significant other or whomever, your family, and really talk about those and categorize those. And so it really gives you a little bit more understanding from a logical perspective on that decision-making aspect, right? So instead of maybe if there's a cord around the neck and they've only done it once, right? So my brain wants to put it in a high and I want to take her immediately to the emergency room, right? And we want to maybe do a hold on her to stop her from harming herself instead of going all of this worst case scenario and all these ways that we can try to help keep her safe. What we can do really is we need to meet her needs, keep her safe. And if it did need to be taken to get assessed at the ER, then that is something that should be happening. But we don't want to jump to the level where we're making poor decisions based on our emotional response, because it's not about us, right? It's about meeting that youth's needs. Okay, and just the final thing that I'll go over really quickly is the coping model. And what this model is so this is really after the fact. So this is in that therapeutic rapport part, right? And so this doesn't have to happen. So it's essentially getting together with that youth, talking about what happened, right? Making sure you're empathetic, make sure you're hearing them out, making sure that we're able to kind of normalize and be therapeutic rapport and build that back up and get that relationship going again, right after all of that craziness that just happened. And it does not have to be immediate after. Again, that youth could be so exhausted they fall asleep, or they still might be really worked up where they're not ready to talk about it, but making sure we're intentionally coming back to it and talking about it as a family is really important, right? So one of those aspects of this coping model means making sure that we're giving back control, right? So making sure that the kiddo has gained back some control, right? And make sure that we are also allowing ourselves to regain that control, right? It's not like we're not tiptoeing over things. It's done, it's over with, we need to breathe and we need to get back in control, right? So orientate yourselves to the basic facts. So obviously, like the emotional brain is going crazy and thinking about everything that happened and being really worked up. But what we need to do is orientate to, we need to talk about the facts that happened. We need to be mutual about it. You need to get their perspective on what happened and really try to be future focused and thinking about the facts that happened, right? As together, as a team. The next one is P, and that's patterns. So it's really important to, again, like identify patterns and behaviors. What was off? Has this happened before? Really identifying if there's patterns. So obviously we can plan for the future and really feel better prepared for those. Investigate is really where you're going to get a perspective on, talk to all parties involved and really get a perspective on where did you feel on that? Like, how did you feel? What do you think that was about? You get your own perspective as you being there, but also like, were there other kiddos there that might have witnessed something? Was your spouse there that might have witnessed something? But it's okay to talk about it as a group and get everybody's perspective and everybody get on the same page, and openly talking about it in a very matter-of-fact manner can be really helpful as far as processing what's going on and working as a team. And again, negotiate what's the best plans. Again, this is really important to get their perspective on things because, again, they want some kind of control. And if they feel like they're actively part of that decision making, it's going to give them some buy-in, and it's going to hopefully influence the way they respond in the future. Okay. And then again, it's giving back some of that control, or sorry, giving control back. Sorry. And allowing them to be a part of that decision making, helping you work together as a team. But yeah, that is the coping model that should always happen in that therapeutic rapport. Again, it doesn't have to be immediate, but it should be something that is part of all behaviors and risk behaviors that occur in the home. All right, for more information, you can actually go onto the crisisprevention.com website. There's training events. A lot of it is virtual with COVID. I do know that there's quite a bit of cost to be actually certified, there's a cost, to be a trainer, there's quite a bit of a cost, but to actually get certified in like that 8-hour training, I know local providers provide it, but all of those trainings should be on that website and you should be able to find them pretty easily. If not, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to give you more information on that. And if we don't have any questions, which I don't see any in the chat box, I will go ahead and honor your time because we are actually at that full hour. So thank you so much for everybody who's able to be a part of this. It means a lot to me, and I hope you found it beneficial. And again, if you are needing any assistance as far as being an adoptive parent or needing support, or if you have any questions following, if you want a certificate or for attending this to get some CEE hours, please feel free to contact me and email me, and I would be happy to get that to you. But I will go ahead and end it now. Thank you so much, and everybody have a good evening.